time now is 7:30. Celebration. A lifetime of music making. Edward Greenfield introduces records of music conducted by Sir Adrian Boult, who was 85 on Monday. This programme is being broadcast in stereo.
Sir Adrian Boult was the first musician ever to conduct that music of Gustav Holst, his suite The Planets. The great melody from Jupiter brings to mind at once the tall, commanding figure, military moustache twitching, an exceptionally long baton crisply swivelling from the most supple of wrists. Sir Adrian, 85 last Monday, still has no equal in noble music like that. British music, with which he's so closely identified, he seems to have played an essential part in its very creation. Though even as I say that, I wonder whether he would like me to put it that way. Here's someone who sharply refuses to inflate the conductor's role, who likes to be heard, not seen, who rarely, if ever, plays the showman. It's ironic that he chose for the title of his autobiography, recently published, a phrase you could apply aptly to almost any other conductor except him: my own trumpet. It's the music, not the foibles of the interpreter, that matter for Boult.
I'm sometimes puzzled because people talk about seeing a conductor as if he were a film star or something. Surely one should say hear about anyone whose job is the interpretation of music.
If there's a hint of formality there in Sir Adrian's speaking manner, as in his appearance, that's only part of the character. Don't be misled into thinking of him as a stuffed shirt. Far from it. I wish tape recording had been invented in time to capture the occasion towards the end of the First World War, when Boult, working in the War Office as assistant to Frederick Marquis, later Lord Walton, suddenly had an excited composer burst into his office, Gustav Holst. Holst explained he was being sent out to Salonika, and a friend had given him a generous parting present consisting of Queen's Hall full of the Queen's Hall Orchestra for the whole of a Sunday morning. "So we're going to do The Planets," said Holst, "and you've got to conduct." Boult, despite his War Office duties, was managing to continue his musical career, while Holst, until this wartime interruption, was teaching at St. Paul's Girls' School. As Boult describes it, "I think the whole of the school helped to copy the parts. Somebody trained the choir, scores were sent to me as they were released from the copyists, and the great day came. Most of the school and Holst's friends were there, and we had a happy party." When later the score was published, the composer inscribed a special copy. "This score is the property of Adrian Boult, who first caused the planets to shine in public, and so earned the gratitude of Gustav Holst." Mercury, the Winged Messenger, from The Planet Suite by Holst. When Boult first conducted that music in 1918, he was already an up-and-coming figure, not quite 30. From his earliest childhood, it had been pretty clear that he was going to become a musician. But at first it looked as though he'd be a composer, writing his first composition at the age of 7, a romance for violin. The following year he produced a string quartet, which friends of his parents came to the house to play. He was very galled when, because he'd left out the rests and blank bars in the parts, the performance had to be abandoned. But then, as later, he knew exactly what he wanted. His mother used to tell a family story about the visit of a corpulent friend to whom Adrian showed his latest composition. The friend patronisingly pointed out some mistakes and pencilled in a few alterations here and there. Stifling his real feelings, Master Adrian thanked the visitor and took the music back to his room before preparing to go out for a walk. His mother found him a few minutes later in full rebellion, sitting on the playroom divan with a boot in each hand, banging on the cushions and saying savagely over and over again, "To think that I have to go for a walk with a sausagey dumpling that alters one's things." No, people alter Boult's things, at least as far as music is concerned, at their peril. He knows his own mind, yet he can always see more than one side. He's just recorded Bach's Brandenburg concertos, deliberately recalling his own first experience of the music when he was a student. In his note he says, "These performances of the wonderful 6 concertos are taking our audience back to the Bach of 1900, to the smooth and solid expression given by a far larger orchestra than Bach could ever contemplate." But he adds broad-mindedly, "Those who prefer the delicate staccato interpretations of the 60s will have no difficulty in finding many excellent records in that vein." Here's Boult in the last movement of the second Brandenburg. last movement of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 2, with Sir Adrian Boult conducting the London Philharmonic Orchestra. Sir Adrian may be harking back there to the musical fashions of his youth, but no one could possibly call it a stuffy performance. As I've hinted already, he isn't quite the man he may seem on the surface. His views on the world and its problems are far from being those of a retired colonel. In some ways he's not even a real establishment figure, and though his manner may seem benign, particularly now in his 80s, he can flash out a biting remark very promptly indeed. The other year he was recording Vaughan Williams's Sea Symphony with the London Philharmonic Orchestra and London Philharmonic Choir. His recording manager, Christopher Bishop, pointed out that the words of the choir couldn't be heard, and Sir Adrian lectured his singers for several minutes, at the end of which one of the ladies in the choir, long established and bristling at the reproof, suggested that when it came to words the choir could never hear what Sir Adrian said either. The conductor sprang. Fixing his critic firmly, he told her, "Then why in heaven's name didn't you tell me 40 years ago?" He was also recording Vaughan Williams, the opera, The Pilgrim's Progress, when this happened.
One. Now. Keep it moving. Oh, stop. You know, people, you're getting worse and worse. You don't pay slightest attention. You go on playing. You talk like market women half the time. It's only because I happen to be able to shout you down that I do.
Words quite clear enough there. Boult knows better than most that a little sharpness, without tantrum of course, is very effective in getting a rehearsal going. In that record of Vaughan Williams's opera, based on Bunyan, the results could hardly have been sweeter or more honeyed in the end. The scene at the end of Act 1 of The House Beautiful.
Sing
Ian Partridge was the tenor soloist there at the end of Act One of Vaughan Williams's opera The Pilgrim's Progress. That rehearsal passage I played earlier isn't quite typical, of course. For one thing, it's rare that Boult says as much as that. He aims to use a phrase of his at talking with the point of the stick.
I've said a good deal about trusting the orchestra and indicated how, as time goes on, I'm feeling more and more that we conductors talk a very great deal about things which are already known to our players. And I find at rehearsal that I can often spare my breath by just playing a passage a second time, when it has corrected itself according to my wishes without a word being said.
That's the man who in the 30s established a reputation as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, orchestra builder ever seen in this country. It was he who moulded the BBC Symphony Orchestra from its beginnings in 1930 into one of the great virtuoso orchestras of the day. It was one of the innovations of John Reith, first Director-General of the BBC, to have this orchestra on a permanent basis, unknown in London before that. Boult took on the back-breaking task of acting not only as principal conductor, but as the corporation's Director of Music too, an administrative post. Well within 5 years, he had the greatest conductors in the world clamouring to come and direct the orchestra. Toscanini worked with it for the first time in 1935, and after that came regularly until the war. In fact, Boult's orchestra was the only one not trained by Toscanini himself with which the Italian maestro ever agreed to make records. Characteristically, Boult, the conductor, deferred to Boult, the director of music. He never pushed his own claims ahead of those he admired. In fact, when he was on the point of taking up his job with the BBC, he made a bitter stand over what he regarded as a slight by the corporation to Sir Henry Wood, something he refused to be associated with. That defiance was in the face of Sir John Reith, who by all accounts appointed Boult thinking he would be a yes-man. He soon learnt better. It's now a quarter of a century since Boult left the BBC, an amazing thought. His mark is still with the corporation, just as Stokowski's still is in Philadelphia. We may sometimes forget what an enormously wide repertory he covered, particularly during the war, when the orchestra was evacuated and under difficult conditions had to provide the whole nation with its basic diet of music. That's how I myself heard so much music for the first time, from Bach and Handel to Stravinsky and Shostakovich. Boult in Tchaikovsky could be electrifying, and how sympathetic he's always been in Rachmaninoff. the opening of Rachmaninoff's first piano concerto, the soloist was Peter Katin. I can just imagine Boult conducting that, underplaying the gestures but still drawing out the warmest, most sympathetic phrasing. It's worth remembering that though Boult himself may be a reticent man, the conductor he's always admired more than any is the arch-romantic Arthur Nikisch, with whom he studied in Leipzig just before the First World War. No wonder that romantic music has often inspired Boult's most vivid performances. With concerto soloists, there's no conductor more understanding. I'll always treasure the memory of the EMI anniversary concert last November, when he conducted the London Symphony Orchestra in Mozart's C minor piano concerto, with André Previn forsaking his baton for the keyboard. Not a wasted gesture from Boult. Perfect understanding between two professionals. That point was borne out when, during rehearsals for the coming production at Covent Garden of Mozart's La Clemenza di Tito, not conducted by Boult, by the way, I asked Janet Baker what she thought the special qualities of Boult as a conductor were.
What strikes me immediately is his sense of economy, his economy of style, allied to a clarity which makes working with him a tremendously easy thing. I think he's also inclined to be an understated person. I think he understates himself. One takes his talent almost for granted because the technique is simple, and he is a simple person, a direct person. I remember when we recorded the Alto Rhapsody. After the session, it struck me with what tremendous speed the work had been got through, not through any sense of feeling rushed at all, but purely because of this sense of economy and the clarity of purpose and stick technique that went with it.
end of Brahms's Alto Rhapsody with Janet Baker as soloist and Sir Adrian again conducting the London Philharmonic, the orchestra with which since his BBC days he's kept up a special relationship. I asked Janet Baker what Boult was like as an accompanist.
He has a tremendous ear. Again, one always goes back to the simplicity of his style and his musicianship, which makes for ease of communication. If he wants to tell you something or suggest something, it's done in this characteristic way. Directness of style and the words he uses and his manner are all slanted in this direction. Maybe one could say typically English. I don't know if there is such a thing as typical Englishness. He might be said to combine many of those qualities in his character. And I'm sure this has been said many times before, that because he doesn't show a tremendously flashy temperament, one is inclined to forget his real greatness until it's a retrospective thing, that you understand how well a job has been done, how integrated the work was, and how easy he makes everything.
Yes, how easy, how English, how economical. Though Boult remains a formidable figure, he couldn't be pompous if he tried, never standoffish. You'd see him queuing up with the members of the BBC orchestra in the canteen during the lunch break. In fact, on one occasion, so the story goes, he looked hard at the rather small portion he'd been given at the cafeteria counter and wryly commented to the assistant, "Madam, I'm interested in quantity, not quality." That reminds me, too, of the time when one of our most distinguished orchestral violinists was playing under Sir Adrian for the last time as leader of the BBC Symphony Orchestra. The work was Elgar's Second Symphony, and you can imagine that for this musician it was a highly emotional occasion. When Boult leaned over to him to make a private comment towards the end of the rehearsal, he instinctively looked up, expecting some remark he'd remember all his life, maybe a memory of Elgar himself. It was memorable, but not in the way he expected. "Let me see," said Boult. "It is shepherd's pie in the canteen on Thursdays, isn't it?" But then you only have to hear Boult conducting Elgar to know what in his inner heart he's feeling. By temperament, he may not be unduly troubled whether he has an audience to inspire him or not. That was his strength in BBC studios, his strength now in his wonderful Indian summer period in the recording studio. I think specially of his recent records of Elgar, the cello concerto with Tortelier, the introduction and allegro for strings, Falstaff, the oratorio The Kingdom, the Apostles now being completed. But above all, I think of the Enigma variations. The marking nobilmente nobly has never had a more natural interpreter than Sir Adrian Boult. So let my last birthday wish stand in the finale of the Enigma variations, a portrait of Elgar himself, but also in a performance like this of a master conductor.
Those records of music conducted by Sir Adrian Boult were introduced by Edward Greenfield.